At 5 o'clock in the morning on June 1st, 1921, journalist Mary Jones Parrish stood at the window of the Woods building in Greenwood, Oklahoma, watching her world burn. Through the glass, she could see carloads of armed white men unloading near the railroad tracks on First Street, their rifles glinting in the pregone light. Behind her, her young daughter Florence slept fitfully on a makeshift bed, unaware that everything they owned, every piece of furniture, every photograph, every thread of clothing, except what they wore, would be ash before noon. Parrish had moved to this place they called Black Wall Street because she had heard whispers of its promise since girlhood, stories of a black community so prosperous, so self-sufficient, that its residents wanted for nothing. Now, as flames consumed the skyline and gunfire crackled through streets she had walked only yesterday in perfect safety, a single question consumed her. How could the most prosperous black community in America be destroyed in a single night? The answer begins not with destruction, but with creation. In 1905, a man named Ottaway W. Gurley arrived in Tulsa with a vision that would transform 40 acres of dusty Oklahoma prairie into something America had never seen. Gurley had been born on Christmas Day, 1867, in Huntsville, Alabama, to parents who had once been enslaved. He had worked as a teacher then as a postal clerk under President Grover Cleveland. But he dreamed of something more, a place where black Americans could build wealth on their own terms, free from the daily humiliations of Jim Crow. Oklahoma, still Indian Territory when Gurley first staked his claim during the land run of 1893, seemed to offer exactly that promise. The young entrepreneur had already built a successful general store in Perry, Oklahoma, serving that community for 10 years. But when oil was discovered at the nearby Glen Pool in 1905, transforming Tulsa from a dusty frontier town into a boom town overnight, Gurley saw his opportunity. He sold everything he owned and moved to Tulsa with his wife Emma, purchasing land on the north side of the Frisco Railroad tracks, land that white developers had ignored, land that would become the foundation of an empire. Gurley, his first business was a rooming house on a dirt road that would eventually bear the name Greenwood Avenue, named for a town in Mississippi from which many black migrants were fleeing north. The road ran parallel to the railroad tracks, and Gurley made certain that every black traveler stepping off the train knew they were welcome. The racial persecution they had fled in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, the lynchings, the convict leasing, the constant terror, did not exist on Greenwood Avenue. Here, a black man could walk with his head held high. Here, a black woman could own property in her own name. The Greenwood district grew quickly, fed by the streams of black migrants seeking refuge and opportunity. Gurley provided monetary loans to those wanting to start their own businesses, and soon the dusty trail near the railroad tracks began to transform. He built 3 two-story buildings and 5 residences. He founded what would become Vernon African Methodist Episcopal Church. He helped establish a black Masonic lodge and an employment agency. By 1914, archival records show that Gurley's net worth had reached approximately $150,000, the equivalent of roughly $3 million today. But Gurley did not build Greenwood alone. In 1899, another visionary had arrived in Tulsa, John the Baptist Stradford, the son of a formerly enslaved man from Kentucky. J.B. Stradford had attended Oberlin College in Ohio, then Indiana Law School, emerging with both a sharp legal mind and an unshakable belief in black economic self-determination. Contemporary accounts describe him as a bulldog of a man who refused to back down to anyone. He had litigated against railroads for failing to provide proper accommodations for black passengers. He had publicly rallied against Oklahoma's Jim Crow laws. He believed that black Americans could achieve success only if they pooled their resources, worked together, and supported one another's businesses. Stradford began acquiring property throughout Greenwood, and in 1918 he completed his crowning achievement. The Stradford Hotel at 301 North Greenwood Avenue. The 54-room establishment was the largest black-owned, black-operated hotel in America. Its modern accommodations included a gambling hall, dining room, saloon, and pool hall. Jazz music drifted from its windows and mixed with the sounds coming from the Commodore Cotton Club across the street, filling Greenwood's evenings with the joy of freedom. By 1921, Stradford's real estate portfolio included his personal mansion, 24 rooming and rental buildings, bathhouses, shoeshine parlors, and pool halls. His net worth exceeded $2 million in modern terms. The prosperity extended far beyond Gurley and Stradford. Walk down Greenwood Avenue in the spring of 1921, and your senses would have been overwhelmed by the vitality of this self-contained world. The scent of barbecue mingled with the sweet aroma drifting from the Williams Confectionery, a popular ice cream parlor run by Lula Williams that had become known as the most popular place in all of Tulsa to be proposed to. Young couples lingered over cool drinks while contemplating their futures together. The confectionery stood adjacent to the Williams Dreamland Theater, which Lula had opened in 1914. The 750-seat venue offered silent films and live vaudeville performances, bringing the finest black entertainment to Greenwood's doorstep. The Tulsa Star newspaper had called Lula Williams the foremost businesswoman of the state among Negro women. Unlike many women of her era, she had ensured that the Dreamland was entirely in her name. She had bought the land independently and owned the theater outright, a bold statement of female financial independence in an age when such things were rare for any woman, let alone a black woman in Oklahoma. The professionals of Greenwood were equally remarkable. Dr. Andrew C. Jackson maintained a medical practice on Greenwood Avenue and Archer Street, where he treated patients of all races with surgical skill that had earned him national recognition. The Mayo brothers, founders of the famous Mayo Clinic, had publicly declared Jackson the most able Negro surgeon in America. Residents remembered him making house calls in his Ford Model T, delivering babies, treating the sick, always with a gentle manner that belied his exceptional talent. He had invented surgical tools still in use decades later, and he served as president of the State Medical Association. His neighbor and fellow physician, Dr. R.T. Bridgewater, maintained his own thriving practice nearby. In all, 15 black doctors served the Greenwood community, an astonishing ratio for a neighborhood of roughly 11,000 people. Attorneys like B.C. Franklin, who had arrived just months before the disaster, offered legal services from offices along Greenwood Avenue. 2 black newspapers, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun, kept residents informed of local and national events. The Star's publisher, A.J. Smitherman, used his platform to advocate for civil rights and black self-defense against lynching. The architecture of Greenwood reflected its prosperity. Brick buildings lined the main thoroughfare, their facades adorned with signs advertising doctors, dentists, lawyers, and merchants. Behind the commercial district stretched blocks of neat, sturdy homes, some modest, others quite grand, housing everyone from laborers to professionals. The Booker T. Washington High School provided education that prepared young people for college at the best institutions that would admit black students. Students studied Latin, bookkeeping, and physics in its classrooms. A public library served the community's intellectual needs. 8 churches ministered to its spiritual life, including the magnificent Mount Zion Baptist Church, whose construction had been a monument to community faith. The Greenwood economy functioned as a virtually closed system contemporary. Accounts suggest that $1 could circulate through the community 50 times before leaving, sometimes taking a full year to exit the neighborhood. This economic insularity, born of necessity under Jim Crow segregation, had created remarkable wealth accumulation. Yet this prosperity existed in a dangerous context. Oklahoma had entered the Union in 1907 with Senate Bill No. 1, a comprehensive Jim Crow system that mandated segregation in virtually every aspect of public life. The first law passed after statehood required black and white Oklahomans to live in separate areas, to use separate facilities, to occupy separate spaces in trains and public accommodations. Tulsa itself was deeply troubled beneath its oil boom prosperity. Crime rates soared as the city's population exploded. Vigilante justice had become disturbingly normalized. In August 1920, less than a year before Greenwood burned, a white mob had lynched Roy Belton, a white teenager accused of murder, dragging him from his jail cell at the county courthouse and hanging him from a tree while police stood by. The Tulsa Tribune and World newspapers had actually applauded the lynching, with the World predicting it would not be the last. The black community watched this lawlessness with grave concern, understanding that if white Tulsans would lynch a white man with such impunity, black lives held even less value in their eyes. The Second Ku Klux Klan had risen to prominence across America in these years, and Tulsa was no exception. Klan membership included leading businessmen and politicians. Tate Brady, a prominent real estate developer and Klan member, wielded significant influence over city affairs. The resentment that white Tulsans felt toward Greenwood's success simmered beneath the surface of daily interactions. Here was a black community that defied every racist stereotype: educated, prosperous, self-sufficient, proud. Its very existence challenged the white supremacist ideology that justified segregation and oppression. The success of Greenwood was seen by many white Tulsans as black people being out of line, forgetting their place in the racial hierarchy. The massacre that would consume Greenwood in May 1921 did not emerge from nowhere. It was the violent expression of years of accumulated resentment, fear, and racial hatred. Memorial Day, May 30th, 1921, began like any other Monday in Tulsa. The sun rose over the oil derricks that dotted the landscape, promising another warm spring day. In Greenwood, businesses opened their doors, children played in the streets, and residents went about their daily routines with no premonition of the catastrophe to come. Downtown, in a Shine parlor on Main Street, 19-year-old Dick Rowland prepared for another day of work. Rowland, whom some called Diamond Dick for the ring he wore, had recently dropped out of Booker T. Washington High School to work as a shoe shiner. Like other black employees in the white business district, he faced a daily indignity. There was no bathroom available for black workers. The only restroom he could use was on the 4th floor of the Drexel building, a short walk from his parlor, accessible by a rickety elevator. Sometime that morning, Rowland entered the Drexel building and stepped into the elevator, where 17-year-old Sarah Page worked as the operator. What happened next would ignite a conflagration. The most accepted account, pieced together by historians from contemporary sources, suggests that Rowland tripped as he entered the elevator, perhaps catching his foot on the threshold. Reaching out instinctively to break his fall, he grabbed the nearest object, which happened to be Sarah Page's arm. Startled, Page screamed. Rowland fled the building, likely terrified by what a white woman's scream might mean for a black man in 1921 Oklahoma. A white clerk on the first floor witnessed Rowland running and reported the incident to police as an attempted assault. When officers investigated, they found the evidence thin and the alleged victim reluctant to press charges. The local police and prosecutors believed Rowland innocent and planned not to charge him. But the Tulsa Tribune, the city's afternoon newspaper, had other ideas. The Tribune's May 31st edition carried a front-page story with an inflammatory headline, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." The article accused Rowland of attempting to rape Page, claiming he had torn her clothes and scratched her face details that no evidence supported. According to multiple eyewitnesses, the Tribune also published an editorial titled "To Lynch Negro Tonight," though no complete copy of this edition has survived to confirm its existence. Newsboys spread through the city, hawking papers with cries of "A Negro assaults a white girl." By early evening, a crowd of white men had begun gathering outside the Tulsa County Courthouse, where Rowland was being held on the top floor. The mob demanded that Sheriff Willard McCullough hand over the prisoner. McCullough refused, barricading the top floor and posting armed deputies to protect Rowland. But the crowd continued to grow, and lynch talk filled the evening air. Word of the gathering mob reached Greenwood by nightfall. The memory of Roy Belton's lynching, less than a year earlier, remained fresh. The black community had watched white Tulsans drag a white man from that same courthouse and murder him while authorities stood idle. What would they do to a black man? A group of approximately 25 armed black men, many of them veterans of the Great War who had served their country in Europe, only to return to Jim Crow America, drove to the courthouse around 9:00 to offer their assistance in protecting Rowland. Sheriff McCullough thanked them but assured them the situation was under control and asked them to return home. They complied. But as the crowd of white men swelled to perhaps 1,500 and rumors spread through Greenwood that a lynching was imminent, a larger group of approximately 75 armed black men returned to the courthouse around 10:00. This time, the confrontation could not be avoided. The black men stood in formation, their weapons visible, their determination clear. They were not there to start violence, but to prevent it, to ensure that Dick Rowland would not meet Roy Belton's fate. The white mob saw this as an intolerable challenge to the social order. Tensions escalated as men on both sides exchanged heated words. Then, at approximately 10:15 in the evening, someone fired a shot. To this day, no one knows who pulled that trigger first. But in that moment, as the crack of gunfire echoed off the courthouse walls, the worst outbreak of racial violence in American history began. The outnumbered black men retreated toward Greenwood, fighting a running battle through downtown streets as they withdrew to their own neighborhood. Behind them, the white mob, now swelling with new recruits, began to organize something far more terrible than a lynching. They were preparing an invasion. Throughout the night of May 31st, the violence escalated with terrifying speed. The Tulsa police deputized hundreds of white residents in under 30 minutes, many of whom had been drinking and agitating for Rowland's murder just moments before receiving their badges. These newly minted officers joined with armed civilians, many of them Great War veterans with military training, to form what a recent Department of Justice report would later describe as a coordinated military-style attack. The mob gathered weapons, ammunition, and incendiary materials. They commandeered automobiles and trucks. They organized themselves into assault groups with specific objectives. By the early morning hours of June 1st, an estimated force of up to 10,000 white Tulsans stood ready to invade Greenwood. The first attacks began around midnight as groups of white men crossed the Frisco Railroad tracks that marked the boundary between White Tulsa and Greenwood. Black residents, alerted to the danger, had taken up defensive positions. J.B. Stradford and A.J. Smitherman organized efforts to defend the neighborhood, stationing armed men at key positions along the district's southern edge. They established a defensive line at Brickyard Hill, between Askell and Jasper Streets, where the terrain offered some advantage. Throughout the dark hours, sporadic firefights erupted along the border. The distinctive crack of rifles punctuated the night, accompanied by the occasional deeper boom of shotguns. From her window in the Woods building, Mary Jones Parrish watched and waited, her daughter sleeping beside her, as the sounds of battle drew closer. At approximately 5:00 in the morning on June 1st, a steam whistle pierced the pre-dawn quiet, the signal for the coordinated invasion to begin. What followed was not spontaneous mob violence, but an organized military operation. White forces advanced into Greenwood from multiple directions simultaneously. They moved systematically from block to block, from house to house, following a methodical pattern of destruction. Upon reaching each home, they would order the residents out at gunpoint, march them toward designated detention areas with their hands raised, then loot the building of anything valuable before setting it ablaze. Witnesses reported seeing men carrying furniture, clothing, jewelry, and cash from homes before the flames consumed everything that remained. The looting was so extensive that authorities would later arrest over 100 white participants, and a judge would order them to return stolen property or face imprisonment. The attack came from the skies as well as the ground. Multiple witnesses reported small airplanes circling over Greenwood during the assault. Contemporary accounts describe these aircraft dropping incendiary materials onto buildings, though historians continue to debate the exact nature of this aerial attack. What is certain is that Black Tulsans looked up that morning to see planes overhead as their neighborhood burned. A psychological terror compounding the physical violence unfolding in their streets. Some residents reported that the planes were being used for reconnaissance, directing ground forces toward pockets of resistance. Others insisted they saw burning objects falling from above. The Tulsa Fire Department, meanwhile, was conspicuously absent. When calls came from Greenwood reporting the fires, the response was that units would be dispatched right away. They never arrived. Witnesses reported that white rioters actively blocked firefighters from entering the district. Dr. A.C. Jackson, the surgeon whom the Mayo brothers had called the most able Negro surgeon in America, had spent most of the night at the Booker T. Washington Hospital, tending to the wounded as they were brought in from the fighting along the district's edges. By 3 o'clock in the morning, exhausted but unwilling to abandon his patients, he finally returned to his home at 523 North Detroit Avenue. The neighborhood had grown quiet, and Jackson hoped the worst had passed. He asked his neighbor and fellow physician, Dr. Bridgewater, if he could stay at his house rather than spend the rest of the night alone. Between 7:30 and 9 o'clock that morning, as a new wave of white attackers swept through the residential streets, Jackson made a fateful decision. Hoping to avoid violence, he walked out of his home with his hands raised high in the air, a gesture of surrender and peace. "Here I am," he said to the armed men who confronted him. "Take me." John Oliphant, a retired judge and former police commissioner who lived nearby and knew Jackson as a neighbor, watched in horror as the scene unfolded. "Do not shoot him," Oliphant shouted at the armed men. "That is Dr. Jackson." But the men did not listen. 2 of them raised their weapons and fired, striking Jackson twice in the chest and once in the leg. The most prominent black surgeon in Oklahoma collapsed in his own front yard, bleeding profusely from wounds that he, with his exceptional skill, might have been able to treat in any other patient. The shooters then entered his home and looted it, taking whatever valuables they could find before moving on to the next house. Jackson bled for approximately 5 hours before finally dying. His killers were never identified, never charged, never brought to justice. In the days that followed, the National Medical Association established a Tulsa Doctors Relief Fund in his memory, recognizing the incalculable loss his death represented. In the early morning hours of June 1, 1921, the thriving community of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, lay in ruins. What was once the wealthiest black community in the United States, known as Black Wall Street, was now a smoldering landscape of ash and rubble. Over 35 square blocks of homes, businesses, schools, and churches had been systematically destroyed by a white mob. But the horror didn't end when the fires went out. This is the story of what came next, a story of calculated cover-ups, immense suffering, and incredible human resilience. As dawn broke, the scale of the devastation was unimaginable. Thousands of black residents, now homeless and shell-shocked, wandered through the debris. But their freedom, even in their own ruined neighborhood, was short-lived. By 9:15 a.m., the Oklahoma National Guard arrived, not to protect the victims, but to enforce martial law. Under military authority, black Tulsans were rounded up at gunpoint. They were forced to march, hands held high, to internment centers set up around the city, like the convention hall and the fairgrounds. Men, women, and children were held for days, sometimes weeks, under armed guard, tagged like cattle, and only released if a white person vouched for them. It was a humiliating and terrifying ordeal, turning victims into prisoners in their own city. Amidst this chaos, Some managed to escape. One of the most prominent figures in Greenwood was J.B. Stradford, a wealthy entrepreneur and hotel owner. He was falsely accused by white leaders of inciting the riot. Knowing he wouldn't receive a fair trial, Stradford had to flee for his life. With a bounty on his head, he cleverly disguised himself as a homeless man, hopping a freight train out of Tulsa. He made his way to Independence, Kansas, and eventually to Chicago, where he rebuilt his life as a successful lawyer. He spent the rest of his years fighting his extradition back to Oklahoma, a fugitive from a justice system that had targeted him for his success. He never returned to the city he helped build. While some fled, others stayed to document the truth. Mary Jones Parrish, a teacher and journalist, was one of them. Hiding with her young daughter during the attack, she knew the world needed to know what really happened. Immediately after the massacre, she began a heroic mission. She walked through the ruins, interviewing fellow survivors, collecting their harrowing eyewitness accounts, and taking photographs of the devastation. She compiled these stories into a book, Events of the Tulsa Disaster, self-publishing it in 1922. Her work provides one of the most vital and personal accounts of the massacre, preserving the voices of those who endured the unimaginable, ensuring their experiences would not be completely erased from history. But one of the most haunting questions remains: how many people died? The official count at the time was a mere 36. We know today this is a gross understatement. Witnesses reported seeing bodies loaded onto trucks and wagons, taken for mass burials in unmarked graves. Some were dumped into the Arkansas River, others thrown down mine shafts. For decades, the true number was a forbidden topic, a dark secret the city tried to bury along with the dead. Modern estimates by historians and forensic anthropologists suggest the death toll was likely closer to 300, but the exact number will probably never be known. The search for mass graves continues to this day, a somber effort to give names to the uncounted and dignity to their final resting place. The physical destruction was matched by an equally sinister campaign of calculated obstruction. In the weeks and months that followed, the white leadership of Tulsa moved quickly not to help, but to hinder any attempt at rebuilding. Insurance companies, citing riot clauses in their policies, denied the claims of black residents, leaving them with nothing. The city then passed a new fire ordinance that made it prohibitively expensive for Greenwood residents to rebuild on their own land. It was a clear and deliberate attempt to seize the valuable property and prevent Black Wall Street from ever rising again. Lawsuits filed by victims were dismissed. No white person was ever convicted for the murder, arson, or looting committed during the massacre. It was a complete and total obstruction of justice. Yet despite everything, the violence, the internment, the financial ruin, and the official cover-up, the story of Greenwood does not end in ashes. The spirit of its people refused to be extinguished. Led by figures like the lawyer B.C. Franklin, who operated out of a tent for months after his office was burned down, the community fought back. They challenged the restrictive fire ordinance in court and won. Against all odds, with incredible determination, and by pooling their limited resources, they began to rebuild. Brick by brick, business by business, Greenwood rose again. While it never fully reclaimed the breathtaking prosperity of its pre-massacre glory, its revival stands as a powerful testament to the resilience, courage, and unbreakable spirit of its community. The story of Greenwood's aftermath is a painful reminder of a dark chapter in American history, but it is also a profound lesson in the enduring power of hope and human strength in the face of overwhelming hate. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story important, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Residents built homes under cover of darkness, working by lantern light to evade police who patrolled for building code violations. Attorney B.C. Franklin, who had moved to Tulsa just 2 months before the massacre, filed suit against the city, the mayor, the police chief, and the Reconstruction Committee. A panel of 3 Tulsa County judges ruled in his favor, declaring that the city had no right to prevent landowners from rebuilding on their own property. It was a crucial legal victory that opened the way for Reconstruction. By December 1921, according to Red Cross records, 764 of the 1,256 destroyed homes were already being rebuilt. The tents gave way to wooden structures, then to more permanent buildings. Lula Williams reopened the Williams Dreamland Theater in September 1922, a little over a year after watching it burn. The Black Dispatch celebrated the news, praising the rugged faith and courage of the black man expressed in the reconstruction of Greenwood. By 1942, the Greenwood district had 250 businesses, more than it had possessed before the massacre. Black Wall Street had risen from the ashes, rebuilt entirely by its own people with their own resources, a testament to resilience that defies comprehension. The National Negro Business League held its 26th annual convention in Greenwood in 1925, a triumphant gathering that celebrated the community's recovery. The desks and ledgers and storefronts that filled the district in those years represented not just economic activity, but an answer to hatred, a refusal to be destroyed. William Danforth Williams, the son of John and Lula Williams, returned to Greenwood after earning his degree from Hampton Institute. He became a teacher at Booker T. Washington High School, where for decades he taught his students about the massacre, keeping the memory alive when so many others wanted it forgotten. One of his students, Doane Ross, would later become a state representative and successfully lobby to create the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa race riot of 1921. But Greenwood would face a second destruction in the 1960s and 1970s, this time at the hands of urban renewal and highway construction. Interstate 244 was routed directly through the heart of the district, demolishing blocks of homes and businesses that the massacre had failed to destroy. What had been 35 square blocks of black prosperity was reduced to a few buildings along a truncated Greenwood Avenue. The community that had survived fire and bullets could not survive the bulldozer. Today, the Greenwood district occupies a fraction of its former territory. The Greenwood Rising History Center stands near where O.W. Gurley once built his first rooming house, telling the story of what was lost and what was rebuilt and what was lost again. Vernon African Methodist Episcopal Church, the congregation that Gurley helped found, remains one of the few original structures to survive the massacre, its basement having sheltered refugees during the violence. The last known survivors of the massacre, now over 100 years old, have spent their final years advocating for acknowledgement and reparations that have never come. In 2021, the Oklahoma Supreme Court dismissed a lawsuit filed on their behalf, ruling that the statute of limitations had long since expired. The question Mary Jones Parrish asked as she watched her world burn: how could the most prosperous black community in America be destroyed in a single night, has an answer that extends far beyond the events of May 31st and June 1st, 1921. Greenwood was destroyed because its success was intolerable to those who believed that black Americans were inherently inferior, that they should know their place, that their prosperity represented a threat to the racial hierarchy upon which Jim Crow society was built. It was destroyed because the institutions that should have protected it, the police, the courts, the government, were themselves instruments of that hierarchy. And it was destroyed because ordinary people, given permission by their leaders and their culture, chose violence over coexistence, hatred over humanity. But the destruction of Greenwood also revealed something that its attackers did not anticipate: the extraordinary resilience of a people who had been building and rebuilding since the first ships landed at Jamestown. The survivors of the massacre did not flee. They did not surrender. They looked at the ashes of everything they had created, and they started again, brick by brick, business by business, dream by dream. That resilience is the true legacy of Black Wall Street, not the destruction, but the refusal to be destroyed. The story of Greenwood is a story about what happens when hatred meets determination, when violence meets perseverance, when fire meets the unquenchable human spirit. It is a story that demands to be remembered, not just as history, but as a warning and a promise. The warning that such violence remains possible when we allow resentment and racism to fester unchallenged. The promise that no matter what is taken, the human capacity to rebuild, to persist, to rise from the ashes, cannot be destroyed.